Hello, my name is Susan Jenkins, and I will be offering this training to you today. This training was jointly developed and provided by Evidence Oracle and the Open University of Tanzania Voluntary Organization for Professional Monitoring and Evaluation Network. Evidence Oracle is a consortium of experienced evaluation and data science professionals who provide support to organizations and government agencies in building sound evidence for organizational success. We offer trainings, logic model performance measurement and management, and strategic planning support, as well as other related services. The Open University of Tanzania's Voluntary Network for Professional Monitoring and Evaluation is a collaborative professional network dedicated to uniting individuals engaged in monitoring and evaluation, or M&E. OUT-VOPME enhances M&E profession by fostering collaboration, facilitating knowledge sharing, advocating for the critical role of M&E in policy and decision-making processes. It offers a platform for professionals to exchange best practices and engage in meaningful discussions. As I said, my name is Dr. Susan Jenkins, and I will be your trainer for this session. In addition to being a senior director and founder of Evidence Oracle, I'm also a senior fellow with the Data Foundation, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. The Data Foundation is a trusted authority on the use of open, accessible data to fuel more efficient and effective and accountable government work. It sparks innovation and provides insights into the country's most pressing challenges. We conduct research, facilitate collaborative thought, and think about thought leadership, promoting advocacy for programs that advance practical policies, and the creation and use of accessible, trustworthy data and evidence. I am also faculty at American University, which is also in Washington, D.C., and I teach a course on program monitoring and evaluation. Today, I will share with you my 30 years of program evaluation and evidence building experience and help you to learn what I've learned over the years through many roles with domestic U.S. agencies as well as international agencies, private, for-profit, and nonprofit, as well as public organizations, and in my former role as the Chief Evaluation Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today's training is the third in a three-part series. This training, Drawing a Logic Model, will teach you how to define and explain logic models are, build one step by step, and then use logic models to engage interest holders and measure outcomes of programs, policies, and projects. The first training was entitled Planning for Evaluation of a Program, Project, or Policy. Design evaluations that deliver real insights, and that gave you the tools to plan evaluations that were purposeful, efficient, and aligned with broader goals, such as the Tanzania Development Vision 2050. The second training was about measuring organizational change, and that prepared you to recognize outcomes commonly associated with organizational change initiatives, develop Z models and value system approaches to measuring organizational change, and identifying and measuring system-level change using appropriate indicators and methods. So for now, let's jump into today's topic focused on drawing logic models. Practical information about the steps of an evaluation and what that means for cost and other resources, considerations regarding planning for and use of data, and a light touch on getting results that you need can all be rooted and grounded in a good logic model for a program. A logic model can be a great foundation for an evaluation. So we will talk today about what is a logic model, how to create one, and how to make sure the model makes sense to interest holders or stakeholders. Our learning objectives are such that at the end of this session, you should understand what a logic model is, have the skills to create a simple or basic logic model, and be able to effectively integrate logic model development and use into your evaluation practices. And for those of you that may be more advanced and already know how to develop logic models, I think you'll still get some tips and tricks for improving your process of and use of logic models. So what is a logic model? Logic models serve many functions around clarifying program theory, demonstrating a program's process, informing program evaluation questions and performance indicators, and describing the expected impact of a grant or program, an initiative, a policy, any of those types of things. So, for one example, I was working with leaders of state independent living organizations. They served people with disabilities that had previously been in interactions, and the the government agency that was funding or partially funding the state independent living organizations had previously tried to conduct evaluations, and the previous interactions had really left a sour taste in the mouth of the independent living organizations. And so developing this step-by-step model helped to rebuild the trust, rebuild the integration and the commitment and buy-in from the interest holders, which is necessary for a good, strong evaluation. So in our first step, we reviewed the materials of the program. What was the legislative authority? What were the guidelines and the criteria? And we set up a series of 10 meetings. Step two, we created a draft logic model documenting what the resources were that were used to run the programs, the services that the independent living organizations offered, how they counted the amount of service provided. Was it the number of people served, the number of hours of service, the number of events held, or any other measures of service provision? We also documented potential changes in people, families, and organizations after receiving the services, the outcomes. In step three, we walked the leaders through the model, always pointing back to their written guidelines and asking for clarification if there were what seemed to be contradictions. In step four, we updated the logic model based on these interactions with interest holders. In step five, we allowed for additional review in a meeting and requested written feedback on the logic model we were developing. And in step six, we finalized the logic model. We built trust through the communication and respect that my team offered the leaders and their programs. This set the stage for a good working relationship, and we as the evaluators better understood their programs, and they as programmatic stakeholders believed that we valued them because we listened and we made the changes that they suggested to make sure that our model accurately reflected their program, which then down the road would make sure that our evaluation based on the logic model accurately captured what was working and what could use improvement in their programs. So logic models are visual, and the visual gives an easy way to get at a general understanding of a program instead of reading a huge report. There's a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and there is research that shows visual information is easier for people to understand and remember. It helps make complex information easier to understand and is more engaging for audiences. And that's part of why logic models are so valuable. So continuing with what is a logic model is a plausible and sensible diagram of the sequence of the causes that produce the effects. What is the logic behind this program getting to these results? And it can be used for conceptualizing, planning, and communicating. And it's a great visual representation of a program theory, why we think that these resources should be used for these activities to produce these outputs or level of activity so that customers, consumers, recipients, those affected can change their knowledge, their understanding, which leads to changes in behaviors and outcomes, which lead then to the ultimate results of your program, your project, or your policy. And so the logic model distills all of this in an easy to use format that gets everyone on the same page in understanding the purpose and operations of a program at a high level. Another logic model structure that you may like is this one. And so you see on the left-hand side your planned work, and that describes the resources that you think you need to implement your program. So your inputs, which are the resources such as human and financial, organizational, or community resources. Funding is typically a common resource. and your activities, what you're doing with those resources, how many services you're providing, how many people you're serving, how many events you're offering, how many cash transfers you're providing. In the case of an example I used in an earlier training, those are your activities. And then you see on the right-hand side your intended results. And so you have your outputs, which are the results of your activities, but then the right-hand two columns really get to the results that you're most looking for, the changes in the people, the communities, the organizations that you are trying to affect with your program, your project, or your policy. And so you may have short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes, and then your ultimate outcome or impact on the larger society. We need some definitions for our logic models. And so inputs, as you could see from those models, are the resources the program uses to carry out its activities. The activities are the work of the program. And so if you're looking at a description of a program, and I've seen many, and many times they are very convoluted and hard to understand, look for the verbs. If people are training other people, if people are providing something, those are typically the activities. Other things may be written as things that the program does, but they're not always the main activities of the program or policy implementation. The outputs are the products or units of service that are provided. So, how much training was provided, how many people were served, how much service was offered. And then the outcomes are the changes that occur in the people or something else as a result of the activities. And so you'll have initial changes, which are the things that you expect to happen first. So changes in awareness, knowledge, perception. And then based on those changes in knowledge, awareness, and perception, for example, you would expect later changes or intermediate changes, which might be changes in behavior. Now that I know how to do better, I actually will do better. And then based on doing better, you see the longer term or ultimate changes of now my life is better, my community is better, my family is better. So initially, I may learn about nutrition, proper healthy nutrition. Based on knowing something differently, I'm now behaving differently. I've changed my eating patterns, my cooking patterns, the food that I serve to my family. Based on those behavioral changes, those intermediate changes, longer term, we expect to see better health, better energy, better focus for myself and my family members. So that's a way to think about the outcomes. What happens first, second, and third. A logic model template that you can use to help you to document these things is first you think about what is the situation? Poverty, malnutrition, health problems, whatever is the situation that the program, the project, or the policy is designed to change and affect. And then you have your inputs. Typically, those are staff, volunteers, time, money, etc. So pick the ones relevant to your project, program, or policy. Then you have your outputs, which is a combination of the activities, what you do, and the participation. And then you have your outcomes on the right-hand side, your short-term, medium-term, and long-term. What happens first, what happens as a result of that, and what then happens as a result of those changes in behavior, practice, and decision-making. You also may want to include some of the assumptions. And so an assumption may be eating healthier food, teaching people how to cook healthier food. They will actually do it. They will enjoy that food and they will adopt that as part of their lifestyle. That may be an assumption fundamental to your program that you need to document in your logic model. And there may be external factors. There may be a storm that destroys the citrus trees. There may be a truck strike where the deliveries of the foods is not being made. So those would also affect whether people are cooking and eating healthier food if those foods are not available. So you may want to document some of those likely external barriers or supports for your program. So then you can include them in your evaluation as contextual factors. Another logic model, and I like to give multiple options because different people like different models, they resonate with them differently. So they're equivalent in a lot of ways. Choose the one that you like best. But elements of a logic model, this has many of the same concepts and the same cells, but it's just presented a little bit differently, where you still have your resources and inputs, your activities, your outputs. This includes customers. Who is it that you are serving or affecting? And then your short-term, intermediate term, and long-term outcomes. And at the bottom, you have your external influences and your assumptions. And so you see, starting on the left-hand side, how we do what we do with the resources, activities, and outputs, and why we do what we do are the outcomes that we're looking for, the results that we see. Another logic model, and training two focused a lot on the Z model as a way, particularly for measuring organizational change. But this also may be helpful to you where you think about change in iterative stages. You have resources that you use to do action A. Action A results in some outputs. So maybe you're developing training materials. Those training materials then become the outputs. They become the resources for action B. So now you have these training materials. So you're providing training. That's your action, which results in people that have different skills than they otherwise would have had. And those people with the different skills become your resource in the bottom line. They then conduct their business differently. That's their activity, which results in better, more efficient service provision by your agency. And then that gives you your strategic program results of meeting the mission of the agency, for example. So the Z model is another model that you might be interested in using for developing a logic model that lays the foundation for your evaluation as well as program development. Another model, and this is a real example of a logic model, I have a few of them, is HDSP state program logic model. And you see it divides things into process, short-term outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and long-term outcomes. And you see the direction between the different pieces. So it doesn't just have all of the providers and the processes in one box. It splits them between capacity building processes and incentive and surveillance processes, and then it carries them across till ultimately you have decreases in death and disability and elimination of disparities between general and priority populations. But you have three lines of activity that are taking you then ultimately to the long-term outcome. Another way of looking at things for a complex program that has, in this case, 4 lines of activities, and you see the color coding that helps you to track the lines of activities to ultimately the same distal or long-term outcomes. But you have one set of inputs that are divvied up amongst these 4 different activity areas for nutrition services, caregiver support services, other supportive services, and program management. They each have their outputs and their proximal or short-term or immediate outcomes, which then still leads you to common outcomes at the end. And so this is another way of thinking about a logic model for a relatively complex program that has multiple types of activities that are leading ultimately to more empowerment and better overall health, reductions in emergency department visits and things like that through any one of these streams, but it's offering 4 streams that are all combining and working together to provide these outcomes. Another extremely complicated logic model, because our programs are not always a simple line that goes across from left to right, is this model, which involved 4 different areas and they were split up. And so you see outcomes at the consumer level on the top, so the people that were served by the program, but the program also had system change implications. And so you see changes for facilities at the top of the second area, under the orange line on the right-hand side for the programs themselves and for the federal. So facility level changes, local and state program level changes and activities, and federal level changes and activities. And so this is another way of showing a very complex program that is operating and helps us to say, okay, for our evaluation, we're going to need some measures of individual level change, change at the facilities and the facility staffing levels, change within the local state programs, and change at the federal level and the services provided at the federal level that then go down to the state and local, the facility level, and then affect the consumers ultimately. What is the benefit of a logic model? The logic model illustrates the theory of a program. It helps you to talk more clearly about your program with people that might be new to the staff, funders that don't understand your program and don't have a lot of time to think about your program. If you're trying to make a case for your program, and it could be to funders or to recipients, you're implementing a new program, people don't necessarily have time for a new program. So you can explain to them, no, this is worth your time. This is what the program will do for you in a way that is easy to understand. Again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And it helps to establish that framework or foundation for performance measurement and for evaluation because you've highlighted the outputs that you can measure as well as the types of outcomes that you're looking for that you can turn into measures as well. Another area of benefit is it focuses attention on the most important connections between the actions and results. Programs do a lot of things at a lot of levels, but your evaluation can't measure every aspect. So by focusing attention on the most important connections between your inputs and resources turn into these activities, which then directly affect these outcomes, you can help to focus your evaluation. It also helps find gaps in the logic of a program. If you have an outcome that doesn't have an activity that is supposed to lead to that outcome, you really shouldn't expect that outcome to be met. So then you can reformulate your program or redefine your logic model to make sure that there are no gaps between the resources for all of the activities you intend to conduct, measuring the level of activity you're conducting for all of those activities through your outputs, and then seeing, are you seeing the outcomes that you're looking for? And the process of building the logic model as well as sharing the logic model helps to build a common understanding with staff and stakeholders and interest holders. And so it's just a way to get everyone on the same page about what the program does, as well as what an evaluation could and should focus on. More value of the logic model, and I love the logic model, but it really helps to clarify the program mission, goals, and theory. It helps with everything else, but primarily it clarifies the program mission, vision, and goals and theory so that you can understand the program so that then you can evaluate it credibly. How do you create a logic model, or when do you create in the evaluation life cycle your logic model? I'll go back to the three models that I showed, three life cycle models that I showed in training number 1 in this series, and highlighting with circles, purple circles, where you can create your evaluation logic model for it within the life cycle. And so ideally, you should do it as you're preparing for the evaluation. A program should have it as they're developing the program, but if that's not there, then as you're preparing for the evaluation, it can help you to engage with stakeholders because they're going to help you to develop your logic model. Use it to identify your purpose of your evaluation, frame the right questions, and then designing the evaluation. So you should develop it as you're preparing the evaluation step 1, but you use it in steps 2, 3, 4, and 5. Using this CDC evaluation framework, you use it as you're assessing the context, particularly as you're describing the program. The logic model is a great way to describe a program, policy, or project, and it helps you to focus the evaluation questions and design. And using the last, the PDCA cycle, as you're planning your evaluation, that's when you would develop and use your logic model. So you use it early in the life cycle of your evaluation. A tool that you can use or a way to help to improve your ability to develop a logic model is through evaluative thinking. And evaluative thinking is critical thinking applied in the context of evaluation. And so you should be inquisitive about the program. Why does it work? And if somebody tells you a theory, always ask, well, why do you think that that is true? Well, what do you know that would lead you to believe that that is true? What experiences do you have to support that thinking on your theory? And not in a confrontational way, but in an inquisitive way so that you can fill out the logic model. But also a belief in the value of evidence. If people provide evidence that A leads to B, these inputs support these activities, and we've seen that these activities, when conducted properly, lead to these outcomes. If there is evidence, believe in that evidence and use that to support your logic model. And evaluative thinking involves identifying assumptions, and training one in this series talked about an exercise to identify assumptions, posing thoughtful questions about why and how much and for whom, and reflection and perspective taking. Because the logic model may look differently for a funder of a program than it does for line staff that are implementing that program, than it does for recipients in the community that are receiving that program. So make sure that you are taking into account and reflecting on all of the relevant perspectives of your stakeholders and interest holders. Opening questions is a tool that you can use to start the conversations for developing your logic models. And so you know that you are thinking evaluatively when you are hearing questions like, or asking questions like, why are we assuming X? How do we know X? Well, we know it. I've always known it. This is how I've always seen it. That's not sufficient. What is the evidence for how that we know X? And so on and so forth. These are good questions that you can adapt to really start to think evaluatively and help program stakeholders to think evaluatively about their program, their policy, or their project. And some other questions to guide your logic model. Really, you start by building an if-then chain and statements that connect the program components. And so logic models assist in answering many of these questions, including why is the program important? What is that problem or situation that the program or policy is designed to address? What is the fundamental purpose of the program? How can the theory or structure be effectively communicated? And so you will continually be asking, well, if we do this, then we expect that to be the outcome. And so your logic model is really a visualization of the if-then statements about your program, project, or policy. Let's apply it to a specific example. And so going back to the Tanzanian Development Vision of 2050, focused on goal number 2, accelerated eradication of all forms of poverty with a focus on women, youth, and people with disabilities alongside balanced regional development. This was an example that we used in the first training in this session, and it focused on a poverty eradication project that offered cash transfers to individuals. So one way to help to ensure that your evaluation findings will be used is to link them back clearly and explicitly to a meaningful initiative. In this case, a poverty eradication project that links directly back to the Tanzanian Development Vision of 2050. And so you may ask some of these questions about where and in what population is poverty most common, and so on and so forth. And then you develop your program with that if-then chain of, if we offer cash transfers to women, youth, and people with disabilities, then we expect them to be more economically stable. We expect kids to be able to go to school because the parents can pay the school fees. If then. and we continually focus on if and then. So in building your logic model, you start off with the basics. What is the need? If you know the need for a program, policy, or project, then you know the outcomes that you're looking for. Using the cash transfer example, we can refer back to the example of Tanzania's productive social safety net, which provides cash transfers to vulnerable households and involves community participation. One of the needs that we discussed was accelerated eradication of all forms of poverty with a focus on women, youth, and people with disabilities. So the activity is the provision of the cash transfers, and the long-term outcome is an eradication of poverty, and our customer are women, youth, and people with disabilities when we go back to our logic models. And so starting with what is the need for the program helps us ultimately to define what the outcomes are, because they're the flip side of the need. They are the meeting of that need, and those are your outcomes that are on the right-hand side of your logic model. Then we start to focus on the inputs, the resources. So in the case of the cash transfers, the inputs could include cash for transferring and staff for running the program. So we're going to create a simple logic model in this case, but the inputs are the cash and the staff. Then we focus on the activities and outputs. The main activity of distributing the cash is the cash distribution, providing, distributing, looking for the verbs. And you can document the amount of activity by keeping track of the amount of cash distributed and the number of families that received the cash payments. Those are your outputs. Step 4 are your immediate and intermediate outcome. So if people and families receive cash transfers, what is the first change you may see in their lives? They can now more reliably buy food, pay school fees, and start to save money for emergencies. If they can do that, then next we expect they may have better health from having better nutrition, be more educated from paying school fees and being able to attend school regularly, and have fewer financial crises because they've started to save money for emergencies. So when an emergency happens, they may be able to address that emergency in a better way. Step 5 then is looking at the long-term outcomes and impacts. So in this case, we said the problem or the goal was eradication of poverty. So the long-term outcome and impact is fewer people in poverty. And so then our logic model looks like this. This is a simple presentation of a logic model, but you see the need or purpose of the program is the eradication of poverty, the resources we discussed, the activity, the outputs, the initial outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and longer-term outcomes. And how do you make sure the model makes sense to your interest holders? And that really is through conversations, collaboration, and trust building. So a tool that you can use is paired exercises, opening questions. And so this tool can help you to structure a conversation to understand the unspoken assumptions or theories about a program that then you can roll into your logic model. So for example, if implementation of this poverty reduction program, the cash transfers, there may be assumptions about how the transfer should be made, how large the transfer should be, or other things like that. And then as you think about how to check, well, what is the right frequency or amount of the transfers, that can be part of your evaluation, but it doesn't change your logic model in that the activity is still the cash transfers and the outcome is still the ability to buy food, to pay school fees, better health and education, and reductions in poverty. But in your evaluation, you may want to look at different measures. If we give cash transfers once a week, so comparing people that get them once a week versus once a month, or looking at different amounts of the cash transfers, those can be some of your specific evaluation questions, but both are still represented by the same logic model, which is an overarching quick picture of your program. Another tool that you can use is a group exercise reflexive discussion, and it's a group participation activity, a community approach, where you're bringing people together to talk about the program. You listen and wait, as they talk about various different aspects. You ask a number of open-ended questions that can help you to build your logic model and check the relevance and accuracy of your logic model. You ask clarifying questions when things seem to not be clear, or for any terms that are being commonly used that maybe are used by the program developers in a way that isn't how you would use them, but how they use it is the most important thing for the purpose of the program. And then you validate responses at each stop. What I hear you saying is this: is this accurate? Or what I think you're saying is, if we have these inputs, then we can do the proper number of activities or level of activities. Is that what you're saying? To make sure, do not add your assumptions to the process. And so by having these conversations, you can develop a really good logic model that then you can use as a foundation for communication with program stakeholders and interest holders, and for developing your evaluation. It's a key part of your evaluation planning process. And so with that, I say thank you. I appreciate your time. My name again is Dr. Susan Jenkins. I'm with Evidence Oracle, and you can reach me at evidenceoracle@outlook.com. Thank you.